Hello, dear friends, my lovely audiences. Welcome to the East West Show. Jack Chow on the East West Show with G&E TV. The nomination for the Supreme Court Judge Brett Kavanaugh has been for 2 months a hot subject, all discussed, and the confirmation of the Senate has been going on and on and on and on until lately it becomes messy. There are lots of directions, lots of controversies talking about the person itself and also the confirmation itself as a process. There are lots of areas that we do not understand. Today, to get to the point, to get to the answers of all those questions, I have my big friend, Mr. James Lee, the Honorable James Lee, former presidential consultant for Bush number 41 and Bush 42 here to tackle the issues. So, sir, welcome to the show.
Always good to be back, Jack.
So, okay, all right. So, I seldom call you unless we have a big problem.
Okay.
Right. It is a big problem now. Number one, it's been an 8-judge there for a long time, right? And all of a sudden, somebody retires, backs off though, and then it's going to be 8 again, right? And time is essential, right? And look at the nominee. I personally not saying that he is qualified or not qualified. I'm talking about the lengthy processing of the confirmation. Is that normal or abnormal?
Well, this particular confirmation process is not lengthy. This is actually a little bit faster than what you normally see. And that's largely because the Republicans are obviously trying to push this through before the November elections, just in case the Democrats, for example, are able to take over control of the Senate. So there's a practical political element to the timing here. There's also a practical legal timing here because the Supreme Court comes back the first Monday in October. So they start hearing cases. So you would like to have 9 justices impaneled by then, because what you don't want are to hear a whole slate of controversial cases and end up with a bunch of 4-4 ties. There's some urgency to get the nominee through for the Republican Party and also for the court itself. In terms of the Democratic Party, obviously, they're looking to stall and delay this as long as possible in order to give them a chance to possibly take control of the Senate, but also because they're hopeful that they could try to forestall any conservative pick that in their minds might jeopardize things like Roe versus Wade and stuff like that. So that's kind of like how the pieces on the chessboard lay out right now.
Suppose it is delayed and Donald Trump is still going to be the one to make the nomination.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that everyone understands is that the president, right from the campaign, had a pre-approved and pre-vetted list of nominees for the court. So, even if Brett Kavanaugh were to withdraw, for example, or the president withdrew his nomination, he would just go down the list and take the next person up, which a lot of people consider might be the woman federal court judge that would be next in line to be selected. So,
in other words, who the next up is already known.
Oh yeah, no, the list is very public. There are 15 nominees on it. Yeah, there are 15 nominees that the president, along with the White House counsel's office and outside parties, had already pre-approved, so to speak, and pre-vetted. So they did that so that there wouldn't be a delay in being able to put somebody up.
I see.
The other substantial change that you have to understand with the Supreme Court nominee is that in prior years, you needed a 2/3 majority to pass a guy out, pass a nominee out. But this year, it's just going to be 51 votes. And that's largely in response to the fact that going back to when Democratic Majority Leader Harry Reid was in office, they broke the filibuster rule where they could pass out federal judgeships with a simple majority instead of 2/3. That's carried over now to where the Republicans are applying that to the Supreme Court. So pretty much we're in a situation right now where all 51 Republicans stand together and vote, then Brett Kavanaugh is going to be the next Supreme Court justice.
Lots of people say that the partisan politics are being played. And yet I did interview lots of Democrat people. They say it is not politics. It's just we try to be responsible to the Supreme Court. So
Well, let's
in
understand
your
that-
judgment, though,
that the selection of a Supreme Court justice is probably one of the most political events that you could have.
all right, okay.
Whether or not, if you go back in time, for example, Republicans are still very sore about how Judge Robert Bork was not allowed to move forward in a very political atmosphere. Clarence Thomas and his nomination confirmation process. And on the flip side, for Democrats, what happened to Merrick Garland, where he was nominated by President Obama. The Republicans stalled that to a point where they took over control of the Senate and the presidency, so they could preserve that space for Neil Gorsuch. So it's a very political decision, no matter what anybody says. Both Republican and Democrats have actively gone into that process.
in other words, even though everybody says supposed to be immune from politics, and it's still a political game being played.
Yeah, it's highly political, and part of it is because nominations are at times exceedingly rare, because you have to wait for a justice to either pass away.
A while
or
ago, before you
retire.
got here, I and my cameraman Jonathan had this conversation. He says those judges are neutral; they never know politics.
Oh no, I mean,
as a matter of fact, not.
I think you justices have their own personal prejudices and political aims. That's obvious from the votes that you see on certain controversial topics, where the court is split 5-4, 5-4, 5-4 on everything from gun control to campaign finance to abortion and so forth. So justices are not immune to the political backgrounds they bring when they're nominated by their presidents. In the rare occasions, though, historically speaking, some justices have gone against whoever nominated them. I'm sure that a lot of supporters of President Ronald Reagan are still upset that he nominated and put Justice David Souter on the bench, because he ended up becoming a fairly liberal judge. So I think that what you find is that when you talk about human beings and human decision making, we're all kind of subject to the vagaries of personality.
I see.
And sometimes you may intend to put someone on there who's a reliable conservative progressive vote, and sometimes they might surprise you and go completely opposite.
Yes, to look back into the past 2 months, though, a majority of the process been going on back and forth in the seniority background check, until it comes to a point where the lady jumps up with the with the 36-year story that jumps up, though, and then it totally looks to me totally changes direction.
Well, I mean, obviously,
How do you see that?
Obviously, we live in the Me Too generation, and we live in that hashtag kind of world right now. When if anyone, man or woman, makes a allegation about sexual harassment, sexual assault, it leaps to the forefront. Obviously, it's claimed a lot of people, whether or not it's Harvey Weinstein or Les Moonves or Kevin Spacey. The list goes on and on and on. Now, in government, with Senator Franken and a whole bunch of others. In Brett Kavanaugh's case, there are legitimate arguments on both sides. The first thing you have to understand is that Judge Kavanaugh has gone through 6 background checks already that the FBI has conducted.
And was concluded.
Yeah, and these issues have never come forward before, because he had to go through a background check when he worked in the Bush White House. He had to go through a background check when he went on the federal bench, and then when he went through his confirmation for an appellate, his current appellate posting, which ironically, he passed by an overwhelming majority. I think the vote was like 99-0.
All right.
On that appellate position. So on the one hand, Republicans are arguing, look, the FBI has conducted 6 background checks. This has never come up before. And what has upset Republicans and Senator Grassley and others the most is that Senator Feinstein allegedly had this letter from Dr. Ford back in June, but never gave it to anybody. Didn't make it available to the committee, not even to members of her own party. and her contention is that Dr. Ford wanted to remain confidential, so she sat on it. When she finally did decide to turn it over to the FBI, which frankly looked at it and said, there's nothing we can do about this, it's not in our jurisdiction, and then turned it over to the White House counsel's office, the allegation is that she held it for political purposes, because during 6 days of testimony, over 1,300 different interrogatories that were given to Judge Kavanaugh, and over 4 million documents that were produced, she never raised this issue, either in open session or in closed private session. And so that's a head scratcher, not just for Republicans, but also for members of her own party, where they think that if she had raised this earlier, they could have sunk Kavanaugh's nomination much earlier in the process instead of this like 11th hour. So that's one issue. The second problem we're dealing with right now is that the attorneys representing Dr. Ford, the woman who made the allegation, they at first said that she was willing to testify. Now they've recanted on that, and now she's not willing to testify to the committee unless there was an FBI check done. The FBI, though, has declined because, one, they don't have jurisdiction to investigate a crime unless there's a request from a local law enforcement agency. The statute of limitations, obviously, in this particular case, expired, decades ago, because this thing happened.
It looks like it's getting more complicated than the investigation itself.
Well, I think where we're at today is that I think Senator Grassley and the Republicans on the Senate Judiciary Committee feel more emboldened to vote out Judge Kavanaugh for a floor vote now that Dr. Ford has declined to go ahead and address the committee either in public or private session. Absent any other testimony or any other witnesses, the allegation of the third person that was in the room, another high school classmate of Judge Kavanaugh, he's also declined to testify. He has issued a statement saying that he wasn't there.
Even at the party.
Yeah, and in Judge Kavanaugh's case, he has flatly denied that the event ever took place and that he was ever there.
All right, my friend, my dear audience, today I'm bringing another crying baby to the mother. my dear friend, a big friend of the community, Honorable James Lee, former presidential candidate. I'm a presidential consultant for both Bush 41 and 43. Let's take a short moment now. I really want to sort out all these issues. It's kind of like everything mingled, politics, not politics, whatever. Well, we really need a clear picture of what's going on. Stay with us, please. Hello, dear friends, my lovely audience. Welcome back to the show. My dear fellow Americans, put it this way, welcome back to the discussion about the nomination and the confirmation process of Judge Brett Kavanaugh, which takes the extra lengthy, or due to the media accessibility, so it seems to be lengthy. Anyway, to get the answer to all the questions, I have my friend, Mr. Honorable James Lee, former consultant, President George Bush and George H.W. Bush, both 41 and 43, here to answer those questions, to give his analysis. Back to the point, though. Suppose if Senator Feinstein did bring it in time, though, where should we be?
Well, let's suppose that Senator Feinstein had disclosed the letter back in June. Obviously there would have been a lot of pressure to get more testimony from Dr. Ford, but also other people. The FBI would have had an opportunity to conduct a more thorough background check to add that piece of information to Judge Kavanaugh's security briefing. It would have enabled a lot of other things to have occurred much earlier in the process, where even when you got to Judge Kavanaugh's Senate testimony, he could have been openly asked and questioned about that incident right then and there. So I think Senator Feinstein's decision not to disclose the letter, I think, was a disservice not just to Judge Kavanaugh, but also to Dr. Ford and her allegation, because she deserves the opportunity to have an open hearing. Whether or not she actively participates or not, at the very least, the committee deserves an opportunity to investigate the allegation a little bit more thoroughly rather than doing this. Because, frankly, releasing it in this manner puts a political patina on this, where it's less seen as addressing the legitimate concerns of Dr. Ford and rather as a delay tactic.
In other words, can we say that Senator Dianne Feinstein was successful in delaying the process?
We don't know. I mean, as it stands right now, it's entirely possible that, according to Senator Grassley, they're going to vote out the nomination by next week. And if they do that, the floor vote on the Senate could occur within the next 2 weeks. So, we can play the speculation game a lot, but I think that if Senator Feinstein had released that letter earlier, you could have eliminated the questions about motivation and delay and merely focused on the allegation. But because she did it at the 11th hour, unfortunately, Dr. Ford her allegation is almost less important than the timing of the disclosure, and that's more of the news.
But there's a little turn, a twist or a turn, you call it, whatever you may. And first she said, Dr. Ford, the lady who was accusing him, saying that she was willing to testify. And then she says, I will not do it unless there is a FBI investigation.
Sure.
And the FBI says, no, we're done already, and we're not going. It looks like a tie there.
Well, yeah, obviously it's a stalemate in a lot of ways, unless, some local jurisdiction were to request the FBI's help, which frankly won't happen because the statute of limitations is expired. So in terms of investigation from a legal standpoint, probably nothing's going to happen. If there is going to be an investigation, it would only be done by committee staff.
I see.
So Senator Grassley has offered Dr. Ford the opportunity to talk to committee staff in private session, and senators in private session, which Democrats are declining to participate in. And so it's really unfortunate that it got to this place. I'll give you an example. Justice Clarence Thomas and Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, probably more polar opposites on the court in terms of conservative and liberal, at two separate forums, both lamented how this particular confirmation process is run so political and so personal that they decried the fact that even someone of Judge Kavanaugh's legal acumen and legal credentials is now caught in this position of having to defend himself in the court of public opinion rather than in a legal setting, and I think that says a lot about where the future holds in terms of the partisan divide. I think Justice Thomas and Justice Ginsburg were hoping that maybe the Supreme Court could be a little bit shielded from the mania that's going on in the U.S., but unfortunately, it's now moving into the Supreme Court, and I think that's unfortunate. I think it's bad for America. I think it's bad for our legal processes to make judges such a point of political contention.
After all, according to your experiences in the federal politics for that many years, though, is that a big deal? Because we look at that age, though. One was 17, the other was 15.
Yeah.
They're not at all age.
It's important to have an independent judiciary. It's the cornerstone of the Constitution, especially in terms of lifetime appointments for federal judges. The Founding Fathers framed it that way in the belief that you have to understand that in Europe, in colonial times, the Founding Fathers had experienced judicial systems that were class-based and connected to the monarchy or connected to the government and were instruments and agents of the government. And so it was so important to them to enshrine a legal system that was free and independent from any constraints, whether or not it was religious or political or economic or anything else. And that's why, we kind of view the court, the Supreme Court at least, as something of a sacrosanct entity and chamber, no matter what. And unfortunately, I think, we've been progressively getting kind of worse and worse in terms of how we're treating nominees. I mean, Republicans are going to point to Judge Bork and Clarence Thomas. Democrats are going to point to Merrick Garland. And I think that the inevitability is that every time a nominee is going to be made, we're going to be putting him or her through this kind of ringer.
In other words, are you saying that we are using a higher standard at the confirmation time?
Well, I mean, I think people like myself would hope that the nomination process of a Supreme Court justice would be less political and less personal. Yeah, Unfortunately, though, I don't think it's going that way. I think it's probably going to get worse, and that is a tragedy, really, for America.
But they got a handle. The handle being that is it illegal? Well, the age of 17. And then automatically leads to a different standard.
Well,
you're holding a higher standard.
Here's the thing. First of all, we have two separate stories here. Dr. Ford is alleging a sexual assault. Unfortunately, because it's over 30 years ago, she has difficulty remembering the date or the place or the time or any of those kinds of details. In Judge Kavanaugh's case, he denies ever being there. Not just like, oh, I was a drunk kid and this was stupid and stuff like that. No, this was, he says, I wasn't even in the room. So when you have two diametrically opposed viewpoints, okay, in a court of law, I'm not sure a jury would ever come to a conclusion because it's essentially he said, she said. So in this particular case, we're not even in a court of law, we're in a court of public opinion. So it's less about the facts and more about the politics. And the politics are that, okay, is this allegation enough to derail his nomination? And there's no criminal charge attached to this. This is really a political exercise.
All right, okay.
And in Judge Kavanaugh's case and his supporters, they're weighing the politics of like, okay, can we basically push this nomination through in spite of this and keep our 51 votes so that we can, get him on the court? And that really is the problem here because there's no legal remedy. It's not a criminal case. It's never going to see the light of day in a courtroom.
No public opinion.
And so this is just basically, an exercise in political theater. And long term, I think that damages the Supreme Court. And I think that's why Senator Feinstein's decision not to release the letter early, I think was really tremendously bad because it created this circus atmosphere where if she did this in June, we could have had something a little bit more methodical.
Lots of people say that regardless of a wrong or right, at least what Senator Dianne Feinstein did was unfair play. Can we say that?
Well, I think it's fair that she's been criticized pretty harshly by both sides of the political aisle. I mean, her Democratic colleagues have basically said, why didn't you give this to us? And why don't you give it to us? And why didn't you do it in June? And the Republicans are saying, my God, why did you do this at the 11th hour? Because you had this back in June. So that creates problems for both sides. And I think both Democrats and Republicans now wish that this had come to the forefront earlier this summer.
Now that we are where we are, how do you predict the nomination or the confirmation of a nomination?
Well, we're so far down the road right now, and because for the Republicans, timing is everything because they would desperately like to get this nominee approved and in place before the November elections. So considering the stakes in terms of having that fifth vote on the court, and the court comes back the first Monday in October, I have to believe that they are going to vote him out next week, absent Dr. Ford testifying in open session. And I think that's the only thing that could potentially stop that vote right now is if she were to agree to make herself available and actually have that testimony.
Voting him out, meaning that to get him passed?
It would be a vote by the committee to pass him out of the committee with a recommendation, and then it would go to the Senate floor for debate and vote.
All right, very good. Okay, all right. Lots of people here, we know less politics. We worry about the situation. And in October, when they started the hearing, though, and if there is a 5 versus 3, okay, right?
Yeah.
And what if it ties up to the 4-4?
Well,
and again, 4-4, all the resources are being wasted.
Well, you have to understand that the court has on its docket this fall a large number of controversial cases. There's probably going to be 1 or 2 gun control cases. There's probably going to be an access to abortion case.
Yes.
There's probably going to be separation of church and state and religion case. There's also going to be some discrimination cases that are scheduled. So there's quite a lot that the court's going to take up that probably is going to result in 4-4 splits unless that nominee is put in place.
All right, very good. Okay, my dear friends, today, thanks to the set of brain from my dear friend, Honorable James Lee, former presidential consultant for both George Bush 41 and 43, we got answers to lots of mystifying areas. However, I have more mystifying areas to come back to deal with. Let's take a very short moment now. We come back right away, please. Hello, dear friends, lovely audiences. Welcome back to the show. My dear fellow Americans, welcome back to the discussion about the most important issues of right now. And that is the nomination and the confirmation for Brett Kavanaugh, which gets stuck at the point when Dr. Ford had accusated whatsoever what happened 35 years ago when she was 15, when Brett Kavanaugh was 17. Well, lots of questions answered. Well, I believe that we keep our fingers crossed. We have about less than a week something to do so, or about a week, exactly a week to do so. Let's see, give the best result to whatever being argued so far. Next big issue is the proposal that I came across made by a New York Times reporter named David Leonard, right? Saying that why don't we give a term limit to the Supreme Court judge, the justice, each give them 18 years of term limit, and with each presidency, they go ahead and appoint 2 of them. It goes in a rotation. Well, how about that? Of course, he talks about lots of details. And you read that article, the proposal?
I mean, with all respect to Mr. Leonard, it probably belongs in the junk pile of history, along with all the other ideas to change the court. Changing the Supreme Court to a rotating term-limited process is probably as dumb as Franklin Roosevelt's idea to change the number of justices and trying to pack the court. The cornerstone of the federal judiciary is lifelong appointment. The reason why that's important is that it protects the jurist from any outside political influence. If you were to start terming appointments on a revolving basis, even an 18-year term, you subject judges back to the political process every time they have to dip their toe in the water and be nominated again. The fact that polarization is impacting judicial nominations on an increasing basis, not a decreasing basis, I can only imagine if we started making a third of the court available for term limits on a rotating basis, how that downward decline in civility would even multiply tenfold or even hundredfold. So if we think things are bad now, they would be a lot worse if we subjected justices.
Oh, is it?
Oh yeah, it's. I think it's probably one of the dumber ideas I've ever heard. And I think that the problem is that people who tend to suggest changes in the court are usually upset because they don't like the composition of the court. In Franklin Roosevelt's case, he was stymied and annoyed because a majority of the nominees to the court were nominated by Republicans, and they were holding up a lot of his, Depression era legislation to create different programs. So, in a similar vein, most of the discussion currently about changing the court such as Mr. Letter, comes largely from the progressive wing of the Democratic Party because they don't hold 5 seats. If they held 5 seats, you wouldn't hear a word about changing the court. From then, you would hear it from Republicans. And I think that's why lifetime appointments are so important, because you basically have to wait for someone to either quit or die, and that ensures that particular jurist is going to be able to be free to make whatever decisions they want. And if you look at history again, I'm sure there are plenty of justices that Republican and Democratic presidents wish they could take back because they didn't turn out the way they wanted. But that's why an independent judiciary is so important, because a judge and a justice, once confirmed, feels free to follow the law as their conscience dictates, rather than who their political master dictates. And that's one of the key reasons why the judiciary in America is so admired around the world, because it is free and independent. I mean, you just have to go look at what happens in places like Venezuela and Iran, where religious courts or courts controlled by the state, of what happens when a judiciary is not independent. And I think that making judges and justices on terms really puts so much pressure on them to have to act and behave and vote a certain way depending on who's in office.
That part well explained. However, we still want to understand a little further that the whole thing with the trend, we really wish the 9 judges go politics free, right? And keep that way forever, a lifetime. However, the whole thing versus the fact that over the quote-unquote political free, these two parties are fighting a dog fight every single day.
Well, yeah, I mean, look, you're never going to eliminate politics from everything, but you have to at least try to give the illusion that the Supreme Court is insulated and above it all. And we all know that, it's a 5-4 vote on a lot of these controversial cases, and we know that Justice Kennedy was the swing vote for a lot of these decisions. We know where Justice Sotomayor and Justice Ginsburg and so forth sit on certain issues, and we know where Justice Thomas and Justice Gorsuch and Justice Roberts sit on their issues. So, even though we kind of want politics out, we know politics play a role in terms of philosophy, but at the very least, I think you want to try to trend it downward, or we try to eliminate politics rather than creating more opportunities for more politics to enter the system. And that's why ideas like term limits for judges is a really bad idea.
Take the passage for the legalization of same-sex marriage, for example, right? So there are conservative judges, there are conservative justices among the 9, right? Okay, if we tried 10 years ago, we'll never get passed. How come all of a sudden passed? People say, some people I check with that, okay, now, with the political right thing, the call for being politically right, even the judges being taken ransom, they dare not go against it. That's why they voted.
There are certain times where justices act contrary to what people think. I mean, the most recent classic case is Obamacare. In that decision, Chief Justice Roberts ruled in favor of Obamacare, to the utter dismay of his conservative backers, and allowed Obamacare to take effect, where everyone thought he would be a reliable vote to kill it, and that Justice Kennedy was going to be the one to supply the 5th vote, but actually it was the other way around.
Yeah.
So even when we think we know what the court is going to do, we're oftentimes surprised by how the court acts in certain opportunities. So I think that's why preserving the independence of the judiciary is so important, because you do create the opportunity for those surprises and for those decisions that run contrary to what people believe. At the end of the day, I think, for example, the decision on campaign finance reform on the United versus Citizens decision that took everyone by surprise in terms of preserving campaign donations as a First Amendment right. And then that opened up the floodgates to huge campaign contributions in our elections. So, there are always unanticipated decisions that have tremendous impacts on our society. But those decisions, frankly, those surprises can only happen when the court is protected from external politics and external political coercion, and they're allowed to meet and deliberate amongst themselves.
That said, though, is it safe to assume that whatever we say is the ideal situation that everybody, all the nine, played political free? And as a matter of fact, they do have their takes.
Sure. I mean, look, I think, for over 200 years, the system's worked. We've never really had a major scandal on the Supreme Court. We've had plenty of decisions that people thought were terrible. And the classic one is Plessy versus Ferguson, which established the 3/5 rule on African Americans and, basically indentured slavery in the United States. That wasn't resolved until the Civil War had to be fought. And we didn't get into full integration until a series of cases in the 50s and 60s, until Brown versus Board of Education. So you can't have societal change on the court that reflects what's happening in real society. It is just a slower, more deliberate, more thoughtful pace, which is the way I think courts ought to be, and not subject to the knee-jerk emotional reactions of the times that legislatures are. And that's why the court acts in the way it does.
That might be right. That might be understood better through seeing the different result of the judgment of the same-sex marriage legalization and the cake. The cake.
Yeah.
The birthday cake, no, the wedding cake.
Yeah, the Colorado case.
They're going there. The Colorado, they're going different directions.
Yeah.
And the same court, same different directions.
The thing to remember is that in the Prop 8 case for California, Justice Kennedy cast the deciding vote, and that vote and for that decision was really about an issue of equality in terms of the state of marriage, and he wrote very eloquently in his decision that that case was for him settled when you understand the nature of marriage as a sacred vow and a contract, regardless of who the participants are. In the Colorado case with the bakery, that was a very narrow decision. The court made an active choice to take up the issue, not on the larger issue of whether or not someone had the right to refuse service because it violated their religious beliefs, but they only acted because the Colorado board that handles discrimination cases acted improperly in not granting a hearing. So they kind of split the cake there, so to speak, and gave a victory, but on different grounds without having to address the larger issue. And I think that's what often the court does, is that if they don't want to set a broad precedent, they'll look for a narrow exemption.
But believe it or not, that cake case was not a cake. It is a conceptual case.
Right, yeah, it was an artistic freedom case.
Pretty much a conceptual case.
But that's why in the court's decision, they didn't rule on that. So the artistic freedom issue really wasn't taken up by the court. What was taken up by the court was the due process argument that he was denied due process by the state of Colorado. And that's what they ruled on. So it was kind of a backdoor technicality that got the baker the victory he wanted, but not on the grounds he wanted it on.
Like a compromise.
Yeah, and I think that's what the court does a lot. I mean, you have to look at its history and see how it's trying to kind of split the line here by not granting overbroad. And I think what the court does is that the court sends messages with its decisions to tell Americans that, okay, we're going to let you have this much, but we're not going to give you this much.
I see.
And I think that's technically what it does.
That taken into consideration is still inconsistency of the legalization of same-sex marriage.
Yeah, and I think
doesn't go against each other.
Yeah, but I think that's why the court oftentimes strikes these compromises by getting 5 votes, even if it's maybe 3 conservatives and 2 liberals that make up that 5. I mean, one case that comes to mind is Muhammad Ali, where he was stripped of his heavyweight title because he refused to enter the draft because on the basis that he was a conscientious objector as a Muslim. In that original case, the court was going to rule against Ali simply on the basis that he violated the law. He refused to go when he was drafted. But after careful consideration, the vote changed when they decided on a very narrow procedural basis that Ali was not to be charged because there was a violation of not granting him a due process hearing without setting the precedent that, heck, anybody can oppose the draft. And so the court always, and in that case, that was a 9-0 vote.
As a result,
Yeah.
it looks like a compromise made already.
But that was a 9-0 vote between liberals and conservatives on the court.
I see.
And I think the court oftentimes has gone through these phases where they have tried to get compromise because they don't want to disrupt the social fabric.
Thank you for that. Sounds education to me. Now I was starting to feel the consistency. I was totally benighted when I heard the 2 different results, right? But right now I feel better. Let's take a very short moment out, and I have the last issue to check with my big friend, Honorable James Lee. And when we come back, stay with us, please. Hello, dear friends, lovely audiences. Welcome back to the show. I feel better after all questions, or a great majority of the questions were answered by my friend, Honorable James Lee, former presidential consultant for Bush 41 and 42. Normally, I seldom call him unless there is a really a big issue. And right now, putting together all the issues, the questions over the confirmation process of Judge Kavanaugh, especially lately when it stretches into an argument with Dr. Ford about the acquisition, and things becomes very, I call it messy, not only lengthy, but messy. Okay, now, back to the show though. A last question remains on the proposal of the term limit to the Supreme Court Justice. In the proposal, there is a part talking about being a fair play to all the presidencies. He looked back into history, say Jimmy Carter had never a chance to make any nomination, whereas Nixon, he says Nixon.
Oh, well,
Nixon made 4.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Right. Within 5.5 years of his presidency. So it doesn't look like a fair play. So when they say fair play, though, they say different partisan, right?
Okay. I think, first of all, it's incredibly naive to think that politics is fair. It's not.
Okay.
So like if your party wants to be able to control Supreme Court nominations, you need to win the White House. The selection of a Supreme Court justice is an honor and privilege. It is not a right. If you want to have the ability to make those appointments, you need to win the White House.
Honor of privilege.
Yeah, and if you, that's kind of like the idea of participation awards, which is kind of like the common complaint so many parents have that, oh yeah, we're going to give a ribbon to everybody, not just the person who actually won. So do we give every president the right to go ahead and pick a Supreme Court justice because this happens to be their turn? I think that's kind of an absurd argument because, frankly, if you want to be able to pick Supreme Court justices, just make sure you don't lose the White House, and that's your reward. And that's a pretty simple concept. And for the party that doesn't get a chance to choose, then you need to do a better job making your case to the American people so you get elected. And that goes for Republicans and Democrats. It's entirely possible, for example, after 8 years of Ronald Reagan and then George H.W. Bush 4 years, he could have beaten, Bill Clinton and gone. You could have had 16 years of Republicans. But Democrats made the better case. Bill Clinton got elected, and then 8 years he was able to go ahead and make his appointments.
Yes.
That is how the system works, and that's how it's designed. So just because you get a turn does not mean you have the right.
In other words, it's a privilege, not a quota.
Yeah, and it should be a privilege. It should be an honor conferred to a president to make one of the most important points.
It only so happens when you're in presidency, somebody resigns or somebody passes away.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, for example, like right now, there's a lot of concern among Democrats that Justice Ginsburg.
He's over.
She's 80.
She's
86, I think.
80, more than 80 years.
That her health, might put her in a position where she might have to leave under President Trump's term, which would give President Trump 3 appointments.
All right.
So, the simplest answer to that is that then she should have resigned while President Obama was still in office. So, I think that at the end of the day, Democrats and Republicans always complain about the court when they don't get their bite at the apple. And the simplest solution for that is to just make sure they stay in office. And if they can't stay in office, that's just unfortunate. And that's on them. That's not on the American people to have to give them, the right to go ahead and make Supreme Court appointments.
All right, very good. I feel proud about that, and never thought of it that deep, though. There's one last comment on that proposal, but not only on that proposal. Lots of people say, if you take a horizontal look at other democratic systems all over the world, of course, they are advanced countries, and whereby they have their Supreme Court system. So their Supreme Court justice take terms. Why can't we take terms? That's their last kick.
Well, I think you could argue that in a lot of other countries, especially in those countries where there's more political control over the legal process, that those courts are not really independent. And I think that's part of the problem. I think that there's a recognition in the United States that some part of our system has to be consistent and constant. Because we have so much change. I mean, the House of Representatives, the term is 2 years, and the Senate, it's 6 years. The presidency, it's 4 years, and we have term limits there because the process is so political and politicized that in our system of government, where you have the executive, legislative, and the judicial, one part of that government needs to be stable. And that stability is best represented within the judiciary. Because if you don't have that anchor, then everything else can kind of go to hell in a handbasket, which is kind of like what we're seeing right now.
And
if you make that judiciary more volatile, then you have the potential to upend everything, and everything can really go under. And I always kind of say that even in a burning building, when everyone's running around and being crazy, there's got to be one sane person in the crisis that has a steady hand and a steady mind and is able to remember the past history. That's one of the things that's important about the court, is that lifetime appointments give justices the ability to look back in time and see over, say, a 20, 30-year career, all the decisions that have been made, how those decisions were arrived, because they were there making those decisions. There's a lot of value to institutional memory. I think, in states like California, example, where we have term limits to not just the legislature, but also to judges here in California. The judges can be the subject of politics. I mean, it wasn't too long ago when in California, Justice Rose Bird and several of her colleagues were tossed out of office after an intense ballot campaign because they had voted in cases against the death penalty. So that was a very political situation where the judges were actually voted out of office and replaced by more conservative members. I don't think you want to make the Supreme Court like the California court in highly political times.
In history, when or which year was the Supreme Court system came into being?
Well, it's been since the Constitution. So originally it was 7 justices, and then it was later expanded to 9.
So Constitution 1787.
Well, yeah, it was proposed in 17. It was the Constitution was ratified in 1788-9.
I see. No, the reason I'm asking is that at the time when we have a constitution, we made the term regulation to presidency.
Well, the founding fathers have always said in the Constitution that term limits only existed for the House and Senate. At the time, the president wasn't termed out. That's why in Franklin Roosevelt's case, he was elected to 4 terms. Mm-hmm. After his presidency, the amendment was passed to only limit the president to 2 terms. Mm-hmm. I mean, George Washington, when he was our first president, set the precedent by stepping down after his 2nd term.
Yeah, he had 2 terms.
Yeah.
Yes,
and that was a great gift to America because he demonstrated that you can set aside power in a peaceful and orderly transition. Mm-hmm. And that was an important lesson for America that still resonates today. But the independence of the judiciary has always been enshrined in the Constitution.
Isn't it correct to say that it is upon our founding fathers' will, when everything is in a rotation, though, let's keep a part of the government stable?
Yeah, and I think that's very clear. The intent of the founding fathers was to protect the judiciary.
Everything is moving, something not moving.
Because you had to have some sort of stability. I think they had looked across at Europe and seen how unrelenting wars, religious influence, fights, and nobility, stuff like that, have really ravaged continuity in any kind of society. And because the United States didn't have a monarchy, you had to have some institution that could speak for the country over the course of history. And the court, frankly, is that institution. And rightly so. There has to be an embodiment of thinking that is constant and stretches back in history. And the court, I think, is the best representation of that.
All right, thank you very much. I'm totally convinced. My lovely audience, I really cherish this opportunity to learn those important points from my big friend, Honorable James Lee, former consultant for President George H.W. Bush and W. Bush, both 41 and 43, and he is still helping the community to understand the system. Now that with these questions answered, I felt I went to school again. Thank you for educating me. And for my audience, thank you for watching. And we will put this discussion onto magazine. And if you didn't see it, you can read it. So to James Lee, thank you very much, sir.
Sure, no problem.
Very good.